Chapter 29 The Bridge. Kendra collapsed into her chair. The witch's sheer force of presence was all that had kept her standing. Beside her, Adrian scooted in close, not crowding, but solidly present. She stroked his hair and waited for her legs to stop shaking. The Witch of Words. Perhaps not quite the terror her legends described, but it was a near thing. There was no doubt in Kendra's mind that the witch was dangerous, but there was something unmistakably human about the woman, and it caught Kendra up short, in the bleeding center of her guilt. And for all Genevieve's ferocity, there was nothing that she could do to be more terrible than what Kendra had met under the hill. With a shudder, she pressed her eyes tight and pushed those thoughts away. After her heart rate settled to something approaching normal, she rose. One thing was beyond doubt. Time was not on her side. Lady Genevieve had mentioned a bridge, and that sparked a memory. She picked up the gift left to her by the witch and began to leaf through the journal once more. It was somehow easier now, having met the author, to interpret the circuitous flow of thoughts in the dense journal. Kendra found the place that she'd been thinking of with relative ease, fingers flipping confidently through the pages until they landed on the bridge. It seemed to be connected with a greenhouse, which Kendra could only imagine would be easy enough to find among the columns of books. It seemed to be located still further above them. "Come on, Adrian," she said finally. "We'd better hop to it. I don't think you're—" She paused, searching for the right word. Mistress? Partner? Mother? "Your friend," she settled on, "will be pleased if we drag our feet." She thought she saw something like an apologetic shrug, but it could be hard to read the twitchy boy. Not entirely surprising, she reflected, for someone new to human form. Taking him by the hand, she gave him an overly bright grin, practiced and as smooth as she could make it. "Let's go find the others, That, as it turned out, was a simple enough affair. No sooner had Kendra stepped out of the witch's quarters and into the halls than she heard a cry from somewhere a little ways above. It was more than a little disorienting for all involved. Boris and Maya insisted that there had not been so much as a vibration of her movements while she had been in the room, and indeed they passed right by it without ever noticing. For her part, Kendra was quite disconcertingly certain that this was not in fact the same part of the library she had entered the witch's quarters from not half an hour before. "You're all right?" Caleb asked urgently. "Those damned cages! I should have been more careful. If I'd just been a little faster, I could have—" "You could have done what?" Maya drawled, amused. "Would you have given the Witch of Words a proper talking to?" Boris stepped up as Caleb threw Maya a sour look.
"You look about as well as can be expected, all things considered. Not everyone who has an encounter with one of the sisters walks away from it. Not bad at all, Miss Kendra. Now, will you tell us what happened already? I think your elf is about to gnaw his arm off."
Kendra stifled a giggle as Caleb's face turned purple, but other than an audible mutter of "dwarves," he seemed well enough. They all did. She allowed herself a small sigh of relief. "There was rather a lot," she said slowly, "and Lady Genevieve wasn't especially happy with me on a few points. But I think she was just glad to see Adrian. He got me through it all right." There was a round of impressed muttering, and Caleb even thumped Adrian on the back enthusiastically, eliciting a startled squawk. "The upshot is that I need to go to the other citadel," Kendra continued, more hesitant now. I have to be going soon. I told Genevieve I would get there as fast as I could. But I think you should all be safe here." There was a series of glances between her entourage.
"Thought you could just slip that one by us,
Boris asked.
"We'll be safe when we stay here, is that it?"
"I know what you're going to say," Kendra said defensively, "but I think things are going to be very dangerous going forward. It's all a lot bigger than you or me or anything we thought. I can't ask you to—" There was an explosion of objections. "So you know it's too big for me, is that right? And it's been so safe until now, and
Greenies always do have big ideas and make no mistake."
Kendra sat back, stupefied beneath the deluge the three of them poured over her until she could bear it no longer. "All right!" she cried, her exasperation outweighed only by the sudden and overpowering affection. "All right. I'll fill you in on the details as we go. Time is of the essence, but please do think about it. You can make your decision before I cross." "You told one of the sisters to her face that she had to shut up and listen to you?" Caleb asked in total disbelief. "In her own house? I knew humans were soft in the head, but this is something special. It's remarkable you're still alive and capable of coherent speech." "Well, firstly, you're overblowing it by a lot. And secondly, I'm pretty sure you have to stop insulting me on the grounds of being human." Kendra was tired to the bone, but she realized that she was chuckling along in spite of herself. Even a witch sister only figured out what I was by a fairly long series of inferences. Humans don't heal broken bones overnight, or run around with elves and witches, and they definitely don't have rabbit ears. She felt oddly hollow saying it. There was a sense of some intangible loss, as if she walked on in a body that was increasingly foreign to her. But then, she had woken up to a stranger's face every day for most of her life now, so she settled for wiggling those ears with a little half grin. "I guess I'm something like a fairy, and stupidity seems to be something that humans and fairies have in common." "Hair ears, technically," Maya chimed in. "Hairs are bigger than rabbits, and tougher, too. They're right bastards to keep out of a mushroom patch, I'll tell you. But I take your point. And hare or rabbit, human or fairy, you're a better friend than I could have asked for." She smiled, abashed. "I don't think you can possibly understand how much you did here today to help my people. You were there for me when I needed you most." Once again, Kendra thought she heard a discordant, bitter note in Maya's voice, but then the dwarf planted a kiss on her cheek, and Kendra was blushing and stammering too much to give it any further consideration. Behind them, Boris held up the rear guard, face unreadable as stone. "So, there's no way I can convince you all to stay behind?" Kendra finally asked, once she had finally gotten a hold of herself again. "I know it all sounds grand and exciting now, but I'm going to see the witch Ilia, and when I get there, she might be half crazy. Even if she's not, she'll definitely be furious with me. And after seeing one angry witch up close, I can't say that I'm eager to meet another. I can't ask you to all follow me into something like that." Caleb snorted. "You know, just when I think you might have any brains at all, you go saying something like this. I told you I'd see you through this place, and I bloody well meant it. Do you really think I'm going to abandon you now, after everything that's happened? How could you even believe it was a possibility?" "For once, I agree with him," Maya offered with an easy grin, almost her old self. "That alone should tell you just how wrong you must be to make allies out of the two of us. Besides, my own business is far from done here. I think our paths lie together for a good while yet, Kendra, my dear." Kendra looked back at Boris, but he appeared quite unconcerned by her regards. Not bothering to look at her, he simply said,
"Old-timers have to look after greenhorns,"
as he continued to march steadily, stubbornly up. With a gratitude that words could not express, Kendra surrendered to the inevitable. The five of them climbed ever higher, until Kendra was about ready to consult the book again, certain that she must have missed something. As it turned out, there was little likelihood of that. Turning one final corner, the company stopped, stunned. Kendra rubbed her eyes, at first not believing the evidence of her senses, but it was still there when the stars had faded. At the top of the final staircase, a forest opened up, as vibrant and lush as any she'd encountered in the garden. At first glance, Kendra thought it went on forever, a sprawling world in the sky. It was only after several long moments that she began to recognize the illusion. On either side, the walls of the tower remained, still solid and as near as ever. It was only dead ahead, in a vanishingly long row, that the greenery ran on into the sultry haze of the coming twilight. It was a path, overflowing with life and hooded in a veil of ephemeral glass. Kendra sighed in awe, and she was not the only one. "The sky bridge," Caleb murmured, transfixed. "It's visible from the ground, more or less, but there's no record of anyone passing through it in generations. I never dared to dream that I would be standing here." And without another word, he pulled out his pen and journal and began to scribble feverishly away.
"We might be best off stopping here for the night,"
Boris suggested.
"Not to imply that anywhere in the citadels is exactly safe, but from what you've said of the Witch of the Wilds and her condition, I think I'd rather be sleeping on this side."
Kendra grimaced, before quickly wiping the look off her face. She was fully aware of just how gruesome an expression it was on her. "You're right," she admitted, "but I don't think we can afford to waste the daylight. We need to get there as fast as we can, and any time we can be on the move, we should be. It might be a little more of a risk, but I think it's necessary." "Agreed," Maya cut in crisply. "The sisters need us. Us. And I don't think they've ever asked a thing from anyone except to be left alone. It's damned unprecedented. We can't shirk this responsibility." Eyebrows raised, Kendra watched Maya's abrupt tirade with growing trepidation. There was something going on there. It was not at all like the woman she'd met beneath the Black House, relaxed and unflappable even in the worst situation. It had been getting worse and worse since they'd found Boris outside of Deuce's rose garden. Kendra was sure of it. She wanted to take her friend aside, to do anything that might ease the growing tension she saw winding tight in the dwarf's heart. But there was no time for anything. And if she stopped, she was not sure what would fall out of her in that dark space in her mind that she dared not look in on. So she merely nodded and continued walking on aching feet. "We go on," she said, offering Boris a small shrug in apology. There were no mountains in Oakbrook. All the years of her life, Kendra had been tucked away on the highest hilltop over town in Iris's fine home, looking down at the little lights of the people's lives. She had never thought herself better than them, but there was still a detachment to it. She was different, raised to be a lady, with the responsibilities that entailed. From atop her perch in her little home library, Kendra had imagined that she knew the shape of the world and the order of things. And that at least had pleased her, as learning and understanding always did. The sky bridge, to her surprise, did not have that effect. As Kendra looked down from the immensely high place, she did not feel secure in her place in it at all. She could glean no understanding from her impossible vantage. Walking across the sunset sky, she felt as if she were no wiser than a butterfly caught on the wind, and no more significant. With the light dwindling, Kendra could only see the soft edges of the world beyond the little glass tunnel in the air. The citadel of the Witch of Words was rapidly vanishing behind, and soon it seemed as if they were hanging unsupported over nothingness. Their tiny strip of land stretched across a great basin of swirling cloud, the last gleam of day sending cascades of oranges and purples glancing off the otherworldly maelstrom in a dazzling display that made her head spin. The dwarves were similarly discomfited. Their world that they felt but could not see had shrunk to a taut thread pulled over fathomless oblivion. But while they trudged along with looks of grimacing stoicism, heads down to the turf, Kendra did not look away from it, even as the perilous heights threatened to turn her stomach. She could not. As the garden swept around her, utterly overwhelming in scope, and she small beneath its barest notice, she found a quietness walking there in the sky. A moth tumbling on the gusts of the storm couldn't hurt anyone, and no one could expect much from it either. The respite lasted maybe half an hour as they made their way across the sky bridge, but soon night had fallen, and the colors dimmed and fell into shadow. Something loomed before them, taller even than the citadel they had come from, a leviathan swallowing up what few stars there were in the eye of the storm. As last light faded, Kendra's mind was drawn insidiously back into the deeps. She could feel its claws on her skin, its breath on her neck, and as she trembled, Kendra reflected that even the smallest tug of the moth's wings sent reverberations through the entirety of the spider's web. She flinched violently as something touched her arm. Adrian's black eyes glinted in the starlight, his hand in hers, and for a moment she wanted to pull away. He seemed then to be cut from the darkness itself, a thing other and alien, as unknowable as the night. Then she swallowed, and squeezed back hard. Her shallow breathing steadied, and she did not break her stride as they passed over the bridge. The path was widening now, coming to an end, and it seemed that great pillars rose up on either side of her, enormous fingers passing through the clouds. The glass roof fell away, and the high wind returned, leaving them exposed in the palm of a giant. Before long, though it felt a long time indeed to stumble her way through the night, Kendra bumped into something firm in the darkness. Boris had halted, his hand held back to stop her where she had been following along blindly, navigating by sound and carefully probing steps.
"That's enough now,"
he said, gently but loud enough to be heard by the entire party.
"It's well past time to make camp. There's a low area that will keep us out of sight and out of the wind, just down here."
"Why?" Maya asked, challenging. "What difference does night or day matter? You can get by in the dark just fine. We'll lead the way. You're still a dwarf, aren't you?" Kendra felt her throat tighten in pained anticipation of conflict, but Boris's response was mild.
"Most of us would be fumbling along. We wouldn't make much progress, and I shudder to think what would happen if anything found us out in the open like that, half helpless. And Kendra is exhausted. which isn't exactly surprising after the day she's had. She's barely still on her feet."
That was truer than she wanted to admit, but Boris's tone took some of the sting from it, carefully calm and reasonable. "Oh, fine," Maya conceded ungraciously. "For the seeing folks, then, we'll stop here. I suppose we have to make camp sooner or later. Besides," she went on, a hint of good humor returning to her voice, "it would be a great shame if Mr. Caleb here fell down and broke his pretty face." "For your information," Caleb sniffed, proud and irate, "elves have very reasonable night vision. I could keep going until dawn if need be, and I assure you you wouldn't catch me falling down." He paused, and Kendra could almost feel the guilty look flashed at her. "Not that it isn't a fine time to stop," he added hastily as Kendra's cheeks burned, shamefaced. "I'll go scout out the lay of the land, maybe see if I can bring back a bite to eat." "I'll go with you," Maya added, too quickly. She seemed aware of it, because she justified herself, again switching to her teasing tone. "I'll believe you about this night vision of yours after you make it back without dropping yourself into a ditch, elf." They departed, Caleb already readying his bickering retort. In spite of herself and the growing pit in her stomach, Kendra giggled.
"A lively bunch that you've found for yourself," Boris observed.
A spark of flame glinted in the dark, and for a moment Kendra caught a heartening glimpse of the dwarf's outline against the night. "I'd always wondered how you got by in the kitchen with all the knives and flame," Kendra said with a weak smile. "I'd half assumed that all the old hands in the caravan had been in the garden long enough that it had just rubbed off on them, that they were all just a teeny bit magic. I guess in your case, I didn't know how right I was." He chuckled, still rustling about with flint and kindling. Another spark illuminated his face, a sad smile peeking from beneath his blocky mustache.
"Yes, I had to be careful of you. Most that join the caravan don't ask a lot of questions. It's not an easy life, or one that most people choose, so most try to forget the past, and they don't ask either. But you were always too inquisitive for your own good. You can't escape your past if you insist on carrying it with you."
Another spark, an amused shake of the head. "You don't believe that. There's no escaping the past, Boris. It always catches up with you." She cocked her head, watching him speculatively. "I think you know that perfectly well."
Boris snorted. "Too bloody inquisitive," he repeated. "I had to keep my wits about me with you. I half expected you to figure me out with all your questions and your wonderings."
"It's not like I would have told anyone if I found out," Kendra said, hurt. "You were kind to me, Boris, always looking out for me. I never would have gotten you in trouble."
"It's not about you, my girl. You know what it would mean for me if word ever got back to the royal authorities. You know the risks for fairy folk in a human world."
The words were patient, but they carried an awful weight, and she knew he was right. The grim thoroughness of the Queen's executioners was legendary.
"It's the principle of the thing," Boris finished solemnly. "You never know who you can trust."
Sparks flew, lighting mournful eyes. "You could have trusted me," Kendra said quietly. "But I understand."
"I suppose I could have at that," Boris allowed. "Certainly I do now. Please do forgive me. A man does what he must to get by. You must realize I've lived a long time in hiding. Secrecy isn't the easiest habit to break.
Why? Kendra asked, brow furrowed. Why go to all the trouble and danger? I know that it wasn't always easy for fairies to make it to the garden when they were being hunted during the reclamation, but you've lived incognito for years and had 1,000 chances to slip away from the caravan. Why would you choose to live among humans? There was a silence, broken only by clicks of flint and bursts of sparks. Does it have to do with why Maya is so angry at you? Abruptly, the clattering of flint stopped. I'm sorry. It's not really any of my business.
So curious, he finally said with a sigh, the sound of flint beginning anew. Are you sure you want to hear about all that? It's not a happy story.
Sparks flew and died, and his eyes glinted, distant with old memories.
Damn wind, he muttered absently.
I would like to hear, Kendra responded eagerly. Maybe I can talk to Maya, make her come around. I'm sure if she heard your side—
Don't, he said, voice suddenly sharp. Maya's not wrong to feel the way she does. She's got a right to decide on her own. Don't try to tell her otherwise. When you push stone, it doesn't bend. It breaks right open, and woe unto any around when it does.
Sorry, Kendra said again, smallly. They fell into silence, but for the sound of Boris at his work and the whistling of the wind in those lofty reaches. I won't bother Maya, Kendra said eventually. So, could I hear about it? I'd appreciate it, hearing something right now. She shrank in on herself against the cold, leaning against Adrian. I don't want to just sit in the dark. Not tonight. Boris was quiet a moment more, and Kendra tensed, already berating herself for her presumption. Then he was speaking, even as he clattered steadily away at the flint.
What exactly do you know about dwarves, Miss Kendra?
She brightened, enjoying a breath of relief and even a flicker of excitement. There's not many records about them, she said, with the eagerness she always felt answering a tutor. And some of those records are contradictory. They're always known as stone men, and it's generally agreed upon that they lived in small communities in cave systems. There's a certain amount of artifacts left over, with fine workmanship made from a mysterious material that was very hard, but also very light. I suppose that would be mushroom chitin. Her heart lifted. It had not occurred to her that she had discovered the answer to a long question of scholarly debate. Some records also suggest that they, eat human flesh, she continued, abashed, and that they steal the blood of infants for evil rituals they use to propagate. But those sources tend to attribute those traits to basically all fairies, so I never did put much stock in them. She finished her summary, a little embarrassed at the defensive note in her voice, but Boris merely chuckled.
Well, I think I've only ever taken a bite out of a human when she really annoyed me, he said in what she was almost certain was a joking tone. But most of the other bits are true enough. A dwarf can talk about dwarvish business all night, but I'll be brief. The bit about demonic propagation, that has a basis in a sort of truth. Dwarven reproduction is unique, because they aren't born, they're carved.
Kendra breathed in sharply. Then are dwarves not alive? She blurted. She stopped, going red in the face. I only mean, she amended hurriedly, I thought that all life was self-perpetuating, by definition. If dwarves don't make themselves, if they're, Made? Then can you really say that they... She shook her head with chagrin. I don't think I'm making this better. Sorry.
It's fine, Boris said with a chortle. It's an interesting question for the scholarly types. Generally, magic makes merry with the laws of science. It's older and stranger by far. But I'll say this. Dwarves are made by dwarves. No one else has ever made one, because no one else can feel the pulse of the stone like one who is of stone.
Clattering, and sparks, and a glow began to hold in the fine strands of bark.
But, Boris continued, there's a catch. Not just any stone can be shaped into dwarven kind. It has to be Heartstone, one of the foremost mysteries of our world. No one knows where it came from or how it's made, and it's damnably rare. But the dwarvish race came to be on a rich vein of Heartstone, and as the millennia rolled on, even when we were pushed from our home for a time by one threat or another, we've always returned to it. Always.
Sparks, and for a moment, Kendra thought she saw the twinkle of a tear. It's in human lands now? Kendra asked, spellbound. Is that why you were in the caravan? To bring back Heartstone to the dwarves?
It's gone now, Boris said, voice heavy with an ancient grief. I don't know what the humans did to it after the massacres. They poisoned the earth somehow, filled in the quarry with foul alchemies. Even if all mankind were gone tomorrow, their work is done. There's no home to go back to any more.
Beside her, Adrian let out a low coo, wistful and solemn. The kindling burst finally into tiny flames, a welcome relief to the blackness of that high and windy vista. In the light of the newborn flames, he looked tired and gray, as if he had always been there, sitting in the dark, a worn watcher of the world's turning. Then he straightened, and was Boris again.
I went looking for more,
he said, more briskly now.
Now and again, fragments of Heartstone have turned up abroad, far from dwarven lands. There must be more, somewhere. And if our line is to continue, we must secure a new source. So I left, more than 100 years ago, searching for a trace of new Heartstone. I left the garden and what remained of my people, and I left my craftling, my young daughter, not long after I had brought her into this world.
Well, you were doing something important, Kendra said, feeling rather protective of the old man. It was for the future of all dwarves, and for her future, too. You didn't have a choice, really. I'm sure Maya will understand, sooner or later.
I did have a choice,
he said simply, continuing to feed sticks into the growing blaze.
There's almost always a choice, and I won't hide from the consequences of mine. And as for Maya understanding, it's not quite as simple as right or wrong. Forgiveness never is. It has little to do with who deserves what, and everything to do with the person that's trying to forgive. It can only come when the heart is healed some, and that takes time and work. He shot her a piercing look. It can be especially hard when you have to forgive yourself, he said pointedly.
Kendra looked away with guarded eyes. She would not say it aloud, but she knew without a doubt that some things could never be forgiven. So, did you ever find any Heartstone? She said, painfully obvious in her attempt to change the subject. Boris was plainly amused, but he let the matter drop.
"No," he said lightly, "but it's early days yet, and I've got years yet before I go."
Kendra's eyebrows rose. The idea of Boris with his lined face and bald head in the early days of anything struck her as unlikely. She bit her lip and refrained from comment, but nothing got past the old dwarf.
"Oh, you have something you'd like to say, Miss Arberth?"
In spite of herself, Kendra giggled. She couldn't help it. There was something irresistibly comforting about the difficult old codger. "Well," she replied innocently, "I suppose I was just wondering, if you're going to be doing all this traveling and searching, who is it that's going to be carrying you around?"
"Oh ho! How incredibly amusing!"
Boris slapped another stick onto the fire with an audible pop.
"Well, perhaps you'll carry me around on your back. I understand that you've been toughening up some in the last few weeks, and you aren't quite as soft and green as I remember. And if you start to get tired, maybe I'll find myself a hickory switch and give you a—"
Kendra never did hear the end of that particular threat, because at that moment the world around them was torn asunder. The ground beneath them began to spasm and convulse, as if the very earth were writhing in unspeakable agony. All three of them were flung from their seats as a deafening rumble rang in their ears, and Kendra screamed as Boris's carefully stoked embers were thrown into the air, a swarm of malevolent fireflies. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. With barely contained panic, Kendra patted herself down, knocking the fiery coals from her clothing and her hair. It had gone almost entirely dark again, the weak light of the fire extinguished, and its smoldering remains tossed around what was left of their camp. After a cough, she found her voice. "Is everyone all right?" she rasped. Beside her, Boris groaned.
"Fine. That rock won't try to pick a fight with my head again. What in the hell was that?"
"Must have been an earthquake," Kendra said between shaky breaths. "Adrian, are you there? Adrian?" She swept her gaze across the darkness, all too aware of the futility of her effort, her heart pounding as if it would burst from her chest. A shadow passed over the few stars that peeked out from above, a deeper darkness against the black, and she fell back as from a glimpse of the unknowable. Adrian's eyes glinted like water at the bottom of a deep well as he stood over her, watching something intently. "They're coming," he murmured, solemn and certain. Not far away, a howl sang in the night, a premonition of bloody bedlam. They did not have long to prepare. Soon Kendra and Boris's sharp ears could make out what Adrian's inexplicable sense had already detected. There was the rising patter of many graceful, loping footfalls, with a certain amount of crashing just ahead of them, all converging steadily upon their broken camp. Kendra reflected on accounts of surviving wolf attacks that she'd read. Tucked away in her library, they'd seemed thrilling adventures. But now, the sound of those howls stirred a primordial dread in her. In the stories, the intrepid heroes put their backs to the bonfire, warded the wolves off with blazing brands. But there was no time. She couldn't stop those long ears from twitching, her every instinct screaming for her to flee. "They can't kill you, idiot," she reprimanded herself. "Only hurt you." But that didn't stop the cold sweat trickling down her back. Her body remembered the tearing of claws, of teeth like needles, and her stomach churned. She shook herself. "Stay behind me, Boris," she said through numb lips. "I'll protect you." In the darkness, she felt a bump as Boris pushed something into her hands. Her fingers explored its rough length blindly, a fallen branch, gnarled and sturdy. Then he was shoulder to shoulder with her.
"We'll take them together,"
he said easily, even as the howling rose shrill on the wind.
"I'm right there with you."
To her shame and disgust, the words sent warm relief trickling through her, but she only nodded and steeled herself. A moment later, the footsteps had arrived. Crashing down among them, Kendra heard Maya grunting and cursing. "What the hell happened?" she shouted, haggard and breathless. "Don't know," Kendra replied urgently. "Why isn't Caleb with you? Where is he?" "I couldn't outrun them," Maya said wretchedly. "Twisted my damn ankle. He distracted them long enough for me to make it back to you. He's still out there." Kendra shot to her feet from her fearful crouch, peering helplessly into the night. But to her surprise, she could see something. 2 points of bloody red in the darkness, bounding and turning in a deadly dance. "Then we need to help him," she said through numb lips, and left Boris and Maya's cries of protest in the dust. Her chest burned as Kendra poured on the speed. She could not see properly where she was going, but the undergrowth simply tore apart as she ran. Now and then a stray branch would lash against her face, but she only gritted her teeth. Her heart still pounded in terror, but that was nothing. None of it mattered, next to the knowledge that Caleb stood alone. And faster than she could have imagined, as if her will had been made manifest, she was beside him. She could barely hear the steps of her companions behind. It was overwhelmed by the menace of the wolf pack. Thrumming with a strange sense of power, she readied herself for battle. She heard a solid, meaty blow land and the whimper of a dying beast. But it was but one voice among the cacophony of snarls and growls. She thought that one of those bestial throats was Caleb's, but she could not be sure. Landing among the sounds of violence, her makeshift staff raised, she hesitated. Something was wrong. She considered the scene, detached. The fear and the pounding of her heart somehow dulled as she felt the energy of it all wash over her. This was not how it felt to be prey, the object of implacable hunters. In the whines and growls around her, she felt chaos and panic. With an unplaceable surety, she brought down the branch hard on the ground, the commanding echo of the staff of a sage. Low and forceful, Kendra called into the darkness in a voice that was not entirely her own, "Stop!" And there was quiet. Kendra heard snuffling and whining at her feet, the edge of frantic terror still there, but the mad hostility of the beasts seemed to have been tempered to an agitated churning. She listened for a long time, concentrating on the discordant hum around her until Caleb could be still no longer. "What the hell is going on?" he snapped, his eyes still burning in the night. A host of growls rose to meet him, and he snarled back, the red narrowing to menacing slits. But Kendra only lifted her hand to him with a murmured, "Wait." Finally, she took a shuddering breath. The heat in her chest, as if a fire were burning beneath her ribs, cooled, and she nodded. "Go," she said quietly to the wolves. "We'll do what we can." And like shadows, the pack slipped away. She felt Caleb twitch in the darkness, and she shook her head. "Let them go, Caleb. They didn't mean you any harm. They were just terrified." He stood silently for a time, still watching them. "I could use a hand," she said, soft and weary. As if to emphasize her point, it was just then that her knees gave way. She felt the exhaustion coming down on her, utterly overwhelming. For a moment, when he turned to her, she thought she saw the eyes of a predator. Then he grunted and came to her side. "That was quite the little trick," he muttered roughly. Slinging her arm around his shoulder, he hefted her into a stumbling walk. "When did you learn to do that?" Kendra shook her head. "I don't know," she said ruefully. "I knew that things weren't right, and it just sort of happened. I don't think I could do it again if I tried. You were in trouble, and I just sort of did what felt right. Like an instinct I didn't know I had. It's, all a little confusing." She blinked in alarm as she felt his hand, sticky and wet. "Caleb, are you hurt?" she asked urgently. "It's fine," he said dispassionately. "It's not my blood, mostly. I killed the wolves that got close to me." He was quiet for a time, his eyes still bloodthirsty and glowing, but fading rapidly. "They were getting rather too close for comfort, truth be told. I'm glad you stopped them." His voice was heavy and dark, storm clouds on the brink of weeping rain. "And I'm glad you stopped me. There was no reason any more of them had to die." His hand extended to wipe away some of the blood, and Kendra felt those savage claws drag over her skin, so careful and gentle, and so utterly lethal. "I was like them not long ago," he said in an odd voice. "I was a wild animal, lashing out at everyone. No, worse than them. I was alone, and all the more dangerous for it." Through her fatigue, Kendra managed a smile. "Well, I'm glad you're there to be a dangerous bastard now and then. I've never heard of someone taking on a wolf pack, alone and unarmed. You saved Maya. All things told, it's quite a heroic little tale. You should write it down." "There is that," he said with a considering sigh. "I don't think the elves will have much of a taste for the story, what with me being an exile running around protecting a bunch of ill-mannered dwarves and all. But if nothing else, I'm sure I can rub it in Maya's face." He walked on in much better spirits, a cheery spring in his step, and Kendra couldn't help but laugh. "That's our hero," she snorted. "I'm glad you're here to carry me back to camp, too. Whatever it was I did back there took a lot out of me." The thumping footfalls of their companions finally met them, and Kendra felt the slender form of Adrian crash into her for a tight embrace. She ruffled his hair with her free hand, smiling. I'm all right, she said reassuringly.
"Well, isn't that a lesser miracle?" came Boris's huffing voice out of the darkness. "Running off into the night like that. What happened to us sticking together, An unerring hand gave her a scolding cuff across both ears, lying flat across her head.
Sorry, Kendra said with a wince. I lost my head a bit there. But it all turned out fine, didn't it? Everyone made it back, and all's well that ends well, no?
"I'll bloody well end you, damn fool," he muttered, stomping off. "Come on. Maya had a little sit-down, and I think she has a fire going."
The light of the fire came into view as they climbed the next ridge, and Kendra let loose a breath she had not realized she was holding. She staggered as the tension drained out of her body before making her ragged way over the remaining ground. Maya rose as they drew near, her face lined with worry. "Is everyone all right?" she asked tightly, her mouth thin and drawn. "Better than we look," Caleb said, eyebrows raised archly. Kendra did look, and a hysterical giggle slipped from her lips. Between the wolf blood that had dripped onto her off Caleb and the great smear across Adrian where he had embraced her, they looked like a cartload of corpses. "After I dashingly made safe your escape, O maiden fair, and braved the horde of ravening beasts with naught but my bare hands—"
"After that, Kendra rescued him," Boris put in bluntly.
"Yes, yes," Caleb replied testily. "Kendra performed a certain amount of heroics of her own. She sent the wolves packing, sure enough. Told them to go, and they went." "Is that so?" cried Maya, a credible effort at an impressed grin plastered across her face. "That's quite a trick. How'd you manage that, Kendra?" "Kendra?" She could not stop shaking, the fitful titters of laughter wheezing quietly. She closed her eyes tight, trying to push away the world, but it was too much, all too much, the emotions of that longest of appalling days coursing through her like a roaring river echoing in her ears. Not a sunrise before, she had felt the skin rended from her flesh, had felt her bones break, her mind teeter on the brink. For a while, it was all she could do not to sob. Eventually she opened her eyes. Worried gazes met her across the firelight. From where they were standing, it was clear that Maya had held Caleb back from attempts to comfort, and Kendra felt a pallid pang of gratitude. Only Adrian sat calmly, not far but not crowding, his eyes understanding and calm. She cleared her throat. "Sorry," she rasped. "I need to rest now." She sat for a time before looking up once more. "I could feel the wolves," she said roughly, "or sense their mood, maybe. They weren't really hostile, just frightened. Something is very wrong, and the animals have been pushed out of their homes. They're running scared. The world, it's out of balance somehow." Somehow, she reflected with dark sarcasm, as if she didn't know exactly why the citadel of the Witch of the Wilds was in chaos. "I think it has to do with those earthquakes," she continued dully. "And I think there's a monster ahead of us." Silence greeted the declaration. "Can you be a bit more specific?" Caleb asked, with something almost like tact. But Kendra only shook her head wearily. "It's hard to say," she said, words coming slow. "But I think as much as the wolves were chasing you, they were running from something much worse." And Kendra did not say another word. Dropping to the ground where she sat, she wanted to lie there forever, to not get back up. She turned away from the light of the fire, facing into the deep night, only the barest corner of stars watching over them. She would have preferred the comforting light of the fire. The deepest shadows were nests of visions, wriggling into her head, down her throat, choking her. But she could not bear those looks of pity as her companions watched the tears fall. Kendra stared into the night, felt it stare back, and did not sleep for a long, long time.